Hi everyone, welcome to the Swift Arcade. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. If you've never seen a nib before, running into these things for the first time on a project can be a little bit confusing. How do they work? How do they get loaded? And how do you lay them out with other views and controls in your project? In this episode, we're going to dive into the world of nibs and see how these things actually work. So if you've never seen a nib before and you're running into these things on your projects, come on in and we'll hook some up together. All right, let's start off by just talking about what a nib is. This is a nib, and you'll know you've got a nib in your project if you see a file that ends in zib. That's the first thing that can be a bit confusing. Nib stands for Next Interface Builder. This was Steve Jobs' original company, Next. When Apple bought them, he brought all the technology over that they developed at Next. And basically, Next Interface Builder, or nib files, were how they built views in the Next application build system. In Xcode, these are called zib because the X stands for XML, and it's XML behind the scenes that represents all the controls and how you lay them out. So that's just a little bit confusing at first, but that's the difference between a nib and a zib, but we refer to them as nibs. You'll know you've got a nib file in your project if you see the extension XIB here. And basically what a nib is a visual representation of the view you're building. So the advantage of these over storyboards is you don't have to have everything in one storyboard. With a nib, you can break these down into smaller discrete components. You could have one nib per view controller in your project, or you can have a nib just representing a specific custom control that you want to lay out. And you get all the advantages of seeing visually how your view is going to look. You can use these nice drag in options and do your layout in here. And then you can still use auto layout, add constraints, put these things into your container and figure out how you'd like them to appear. And this is basically how you design your view. So this is what a nib is. It's the visual representation of a layout you're building. The trick is, how do we hook these things up to view controllers in that? Let's take a look at that next. So when it comes to using nibs in your project, you've basically got kind of three options in terms of how to incorporate them into your views. One is you can hook them up directly to a view controller. Two, you can make them something called IP designable. And three, you can programmatically load them up and lay them out like any other view once you've loaded them into your container view. So first I'm going to give you the Cole's Notes version of how all these works, and then we're going to build them out slowly from scratch together after. Let's start with the view controller. So here's a nib, it's a view controller, and you can load that up one for one into your view controller just like this. There's some magic that happens behind the scenes in Xcode that makes it very easy to load nibs one for one into view controller. View controllers just know how to load nibs by themselves, and as long as you keep these names the same, it's going to load them up no problem. The second thing you can do is you can create something called an IB designable, which takes one of your controls and actually makes it show up as a control in Interface Builder here. So here I have something called red view. And in here, I've marked it up with certain attributes called IB designable, something called IB inspectable. And if we go look at this nib now, which is hooked and backed by this view, we can see that there's certain attributes here I can change and select. For example, I could change the color of my red view to make it orange if I wanted. And when I run this, it's going to use this control and change that background color. That's called IB designable, and we can add that to our applications also. Then the next trick is, how do we load these things programmatically? For example, if I have something called an inner nib, which just happens to be a blue square, and I want to use it within my red view, well, I can load that up. The trick there is to use this property, this file loader called bundle. Bundle is how you load up a specific nib programmatically and then lay it out and use it within the containing nib. So here I could define something called inner view, load it up via the bundle, and then just use straight up auto layout to lay it out in relation to how I would like it to appear in this inner view. So that's how nibs work in a nutshell. It looks kind of simple, but there are some tricks that go in behind the scenes to making all these things work. And that's the thing that can initially be frustrating when you're setting these things up. So if you want to see how to build and hook these things up from scratch, stick around and we're going to build them from scratch right now. All right, so first things first, let's create a brand new project. Let's create a fresh new app here. And let's call this Nib Fun. And basically what we're going to do is the first thing we're going to do is we are going to, of course, get rid of storyboards and build this completely programmatically. So you'll see me do this in a lot of videos. A lot of times when I'm spiking and building new projects, I don't want a storyboard in there. So this is just typically what we do. We create a new project, we find our storyboard, we go Command Delete, and we get rid of that storyboard. We also don't need the scene delegate, so let's just get rid of that. We can move you to trash. Then we're going to go into the P list, and there's two entries here we're going to get rid of, the main storyboard and the application scene manifest. Just hit the little negative sign beside each of those. And then finally, we're going to go into the app delegate, and we see a whole bunch of really nice boilerplate code here we don't need. So we're going to delete that. And then I think I've shown how to do this from previous videos, but I've created a code snippet here called no storyboard, which just drops in this code and automatically loads my view controller, the default one here, up into the window, makes it the root view controller. And if I run this now, everything should run fine. And I will have basically got an application configured and ready to go without any storyboards. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Then I'll generally do a little bit of cleanup here. I'll come up to the top of my project here. And just because I like hiding files and not staring at things I don't need to look at, I'll create a new group without folder. I'll call these things files. And I'm just going to drag everything in here except those files I need, which for me is going to be the view controller. I'll drag you out, and then I'll just stick this thing at the top. And there we go. We've got a clean project ready to go without storyboards, ready to load and play with some nibs. Okay, the first thing I want to show you is just how to load a nib into a view controller. That's it, something really simple. So let's go into our project here. And first of all, let's create a nib. Well, how do you do that? You go Command N, we're going to add a new file. And to add a nib, we come down here to this construct called view. We're going to click next, and we're going to give it a name like, let's just call it view controller. So I am specifically picking this name to match my view controller here. I want that to be a one-to-one match. So I'm going to call this view controller nib, hit create, and it's going to plunk down a brand new nib in Interface Builder for me. Now you'll see this is really nice in that it looks just like a full view for a view controller here, which is great. So we could come in here and design this. I'm going to just not do anything too funky. I'm going to give it a nice, I guess I'll make it a blue background color. Now the trick is, how do I get this nib associated with this view controller? Well, there's a couple of things that we need to do in Interface Builder to do that. First of all, we need to set the file owner of this nib. In other words, this is a really important property for nibs. This is basically saying who's going to handle all the interaction and own this nib. For us, that's going to be view controller. So we can come up here, type view controller, and we're almost ready now to use this nib. We've associated the view controller with this nib. The one thing we need to do now is we need to tell the view controller where to find or hook up this view. So while you've got file owner selected here, come over to this outlet, and you see this view property here? Here's all the magic where all this strange stuff happens. You're going to hold down Control, drag this view over to this view here on our Docker on the side here, let it go, and now we have an IB outlet or a connection between the view controller. It knows what the view is, and we've hooked it up here, and we're basically good to go. Now we can go Command R. Now we can run our app, and voila, you've just hooked up your very first nib to a view controller. That's all there is to it. That's probably the simplest thing we can do. If you want to do one-for-one nibs between view controllers, now you can. That's the simplest thing we can do. Now let's get a little more complex, and I'm going to show you how something called IB designable works. So the goal of IB designable was to basically give you the ability to create controls as nibs so that when you add them to nibs like this, you could come here and change all of their default properties. Like you could come in here and change the color. You could see it instantly reflected in the control that you've got on screen. Xcode gives you the ability to do that. It's called IB designable. And let's see now how to control and add one of these things to our project. Okay, so step one, let's create a brand new nib. And this is one that we're going to make IB designable. So we're going to go and we're going to create a brand new view. Let's call this red view. It's going to be a nib file. We're going to go create. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the default size of this nib. We're not going to make it a full view controller size. We're going to come up here to the attribute inspector, and where it says size here under simulated metrics, we're going to click one called freeform. That's going to let us resize this to roughly the dimensions of whatever we'd like. So it doesn't have to be a full view controller. We can make it a lot smaller because it is going to be a custom control. And yeah, that's basically what we can do to create this custom control. We can even give it a default background color of red. And to hook this up and make it designable, we need to have a view or a class backing this nib. And that's where we're going to make it, that's where we're going to configure it to make it designable. So let me show you what I mean. So let's go create a new Swift file this time to back this nib. And this is going to be called red view. I keep these things one-to-one. That is kind of the convention with when you're working with nibs. So what we're doing here is we're creating a view to now back this nib. And this is, now we're in Swift land. So this is plain old Swift here, plain old UI kit. We're going to create a red view here. It's going to be a plain old red view like this. But to make it designable, there's a couple things we need to do. One, we need to add an attribute to our view called IB designable. This is what's going to signal to Xcode that this is not just a regular view backing the nib. This is something we actually want to be configurable to show up in the attribute inspector when we're working in Interface Builder. So that's the first thing we can add to our view. Then the second thing we need is we need to basically tell it, well, what's going to be configurable about this red view? Like, what is it we actually want to configure? And even though it's called red view, what if we wanted to change the color? Well, we could create a var here called myColor and give it a default value. But the magic here to make it inspectable is to add this attribute here called IB inspectable. This is what's going to make it selectable on the right-hand side when we want to configure it within Interface Builder. And then basically just to make our lives easier, I'm going to add two more functions here. One is called await from nib and the other is overriding the intrinsic content size. Awake from nib you can think of as this is your view did load and view controllers. This is what's going to get called after the nib's been loaded. It's now programmatically ready for you to configure and do things with. So if we wanted a different background color here, we could set it. But also this is how we're hooking our inspectable value up here. So we could change the color in Interface Builder if we wanted, and that would take effect here. Now the confusing thing with the nibs also is sometimes you're like, well, how do we size or lay these things out? Well, we're still in auto layout land here, or we can choose to be. Here by overriding intrinsic content size, I'm basically saying from an auto layout point of view, this is the size I'd like to use when this thing gets laid out. We're basically treating it like a label or button. These are other controls in iOS that also have intrinsic content size. So I won't need to set a height or width constraint when I lay this out using auto layout. It's already going to know roughly how big it should be. And that's all we need to do to red view here. Now watch what happens when we flip back to the nib and we basically connect it to this red view. So this is part of the magic of what we have to do. We need to hook this nib up to this view backing it. And we do that by going over here to, what's this thing called? Come on, mouse. The identity inspector. And under custom class, we're going to type red view. And that's going to connect this view to that nib. Now watch what happens when I tab off here. You can see Xcode's building. It's doing some magic. And voila, it updated the control here, going designables up to date. So it read all those attributes we added to this view here. And now if we go over to the attribute inspector, look at this. We have a my color here, which is configurable. So we could change the properties here, and it's not changing them here right now because I have this background set, but at runtime, it will use these new colors and these new attributes in our control. That's the idea behind IB designable with these attributes. This is a pretty basic example I'm giving here, but it just shows you how to hook up a property and to make a nib designable. Now let's see how we can add this to our view controller. Okay, so to use our IB designable in our view controller nib, it's basically a two-step process. One is we're going to add a plain old view to our nib, and then two, we're going to associate that view with the IB designable view we just created. Let me show you how that works. Come up here and let's just search for a plain old view. And this is what we're going to drag out. This is eventually going to be our IB designable. We're just going to drop it in here. And the way we associate this view with IB designable is we come up here and we type the name of the nib we want to associate it with. In this case, it's red view. Now you can see it already did some work. It already knows what it should be and it tried to hook it up, which is great. But we're just going to add some constraints now. Let's just pin it to the top like this. Sorry if you can't see this, I'll drag this up. Let's just pin it to the top like this. And let's give it a width or basically centered horizontally. This is how we do auto layout and interface builder. We control drag things around. And notice when we do that, how it automatically resized itself to 100 by 100. That's great. That tells us that it's actually hooked up to our red view. It's actually reading the intrinsic content size in there, and that's how it knew to make it 100 by 100. So that's good. So once we've got that in there, we can now run this and see this show up in our view controller. Hey, great, we've got a red square in here. But here's the power of IB designable. If we come back in here and we click on our view, look what we can do if we go to the attribute inspector. We can change its color in interface builder. So we could pick a different color like purple and run it. And because we've connected it behind the scenes and because it's working, we can now change the color or design our controls in Interface Builder. That's kind of the whole point behind Interface Builder, enabling you to do this. And there we've set it up, and now you know how to hook these things up. Okay, so for our final trick with nibs, let's see how we can load up a nib programmatically. This is really useful if you just want to do some custom layout yourself, if you need to have full control over how you want things to lay out. Let's see what it's like to create a new nib, add it programmatically to this one, and then do some basic auto layout. So let's come back over here and let's create a new view. Let's call this one inner view. Inner view. This is just going to be a nib, and we'll go ahead and we'll just do some basic styling on it. Let's make it freeform. Let's make it nice and small just to kind of hint this is a custom view that we'd like. And let's make its background color something nice like orange. Now we need to associate a view to that nib. So this is getting to be old hand a little bit now. Let's come in here and create a inner view. This is the view that's going to be backing this new nib we just created. And I'm just going to copy in some code here to speed things up. This is just going to be a plain old UI view. Here's our viewed load equivalent in nib. And we're just going to give it intrinsic content size of 200. That's fine. And now we just need to associate this view with the nib, which of course we do by coming up here and going custom class inner view. Okay, so those are hooked up. Now, how do we get this nib into our red view? Let's see how we can do that. Okay, well, let's go over to where we're actually going to do our programmatic work on loading this nib in our red view here. And basically, we're going to treat this just like any other view we'd load. We're going to start by just defining a variable up here called inner view. And this is going to be of type inner view, the class we just created. We're going to implicitly load this. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use a really neat function called, actually a class called bundle. And this is how we programmatically load a nib into a view. We do it with this. We go bundle for, passing in the type of the view that we want to load. Then we give it the name of our nib, load nib named, and we just put it in this concatenated string printout like this. We make the owner ourselves, and we're just going to implicitly unwrap it. We're going to grab the first one that comes back from this array, and then we're just going to cast it back to the view we're expecting inner view. That's how we're going to load these things up. Then once we've got them loaded, now we're basically in auto layout land. We can do whatever we'd like with this view once it's loaded. So for example, we could set up some auto layout like this, where basically we just set ourselves up, basically saying we're ready for auto layout because we ourselves are a view. We're going to put our translate auto resize mask to false. We'll do the same thing for the inner view, configure you for auto layout. We'll then add the inner view to the view we're currently in, and then we'll just do some auto layout. Here we can set the width of the inner view. We can pin it to the top, just underneath with a spacing of 16, multiplier of 2, 1 multiplier is equal to 8 points. And if we do all that and now run the application, this will programmatically load up the view, apply the auto layouts, and voila. This is how we can programmatically load up a nib and display it in another view. If you want to see some notes on how to do this, just head over to my repo Swift Arcade. And down here under Foundation, I've included a link to the article, Working with Nibs. And here I just kind of walk you through sort of the steps, just to remind myself basically how to do these things, because I can never remember. So hopefully that will help you understand what's going on. But basically that's all there is to working with Nibs. It is a little bit confusing at first. Things can go wrong when you're hooking up these classes. But if you just take it really methodically, take it slow, add a nib to a view controller, see to make it designable if that's something you want to do, and then ultimately load it programmatically, that should cover most of the use cases you're going to need to how to work with these things. And once you've got your hands on those views, you can just lay them out in style however you like. Okay, thanks so much for coming, everyone. I hope that helps. Good luck on your projects, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.